Centenas de milhões de pessoas em todo o planeta usam a internet todos os dias. A previsão é que em breve serão bilhões. Muitos veem nessa nova tecnologia uma força histórica, capaz de transformar o mundo, a sociedade, a economia. O culto à internet tornou-se praticamente uma nova religião. Mas se a rede tem seus apóstolos e profetas, tem também seus hereges. E um dos mais veementes e influentes hereges da internet é Evgeni Morozov, um jovem pensador nascido na Bielorrússia, que aos 29 anos se tornou uma estrela do mundo acadêmico americano. Ao contrário da utopia prometida pelos ideólogos da era da informação, Morozov alerta para o risco que a democracia corre se os tecnocratas da internet impuserem seu projeto de controle social. Um perigo que o escândalo da espionagem eletrônica pelo governo americano deixou bem claro. O sonho de uma sociedade tecnológica perfeita, ele diz, é na verdade um pesadelo autoritário. Morozov reside em Cambridge, onde é pesquisador da Harvard University. E de passagem por Nova York, falou ao Milênio sobre sua visão iconoclasta da internet e seus mitos.
We should look at the internet in a more realistic way. Is that a good summary of what you do? But you do much more than that, right?
Sure. I mean, there are several claims in what you've just said. So there is clearly my effort to understand why we tend to believe that technology, information technology specifically, is going to liberate the world or save the world from hunger or inequality or poverty. I mean, if you listen to some of the rhetoric that's coming out of Silicon Valley, you can clearly hear that there are a lot of people there who passionately believe that apps can change the world, right? And I've been trying to find holes in that rhetoric because I think it's ultimately rests on very naive set of expectations about how the world works, how power is distributed, why we actually have poverty. It's not just a matter of people lacking information about how to be smart, right? If you could only tell people how to be smart via their smartphones, some people in Silicon Valley think that they will automatically start behaving better, right? I don't think that this is the cause of poverty, so that's why information technology itself cannot alleviate it. That problem. But there are also many other levels to my critique. Some of it has to do with the fact how we try to see the internet as some unique historical force like the printing press that is going to transform the world and is going to transform it in some one-directional, coherent manner. So it will be more democratization, more access to tools, more access to knowledge, more empowerment to the individual. And I think that we have to be very careful about drawing such radical conclusions, particularly about the coherence of the effects we are seeing. Very often, the effects are not that coherent at all. In many cases, the technologies for decentralization that we worship actually end up empowering already centralized actors. Back in the day, in the 70s, for example, when Silicon Valley was so excited about the personal computer, their thinking was that as we get away from these huge mainframe computers that you need a room to occupy, as we move to more small and personal items, we'd actually end up in a world where people have more power. To some extent this has happened, but what those people have missed is that data and information became extremely important. And while we're all carrying personal computers in our pockets, it's still centralized servers on huge server farms somewhere in California that determine our lives, right? So you have centralization and decentralization happening at once, and we need to be able to determine such trends simultaneously and not just fall into simplistic one-mode kind of thinking. And my fear when I was writing my first book several years ago was that unless we take some drastic measures, particularly in curtailing the spread of surveillance equipment that is manufactured by the same companies in Silicon Valley, if we do not curtail that trade, we'll actually end up with many of those tools becoming even less emancipatory than we think. And they'll actually become very powerful tools of oppression rather than emancipation. To some extent, that's what I think has happened in many of those countries.
Now that the NSA scandal happened, Snowden revelations came out, Brazil, for instance, is thinking about that, of having an internet that is controlled by Brazil. is that viable? Does that make sense? What has the Snowden revelations done to all the thinking around the internet, especially in your case?
Sure. Well, one of the, I think, most controversial ideas in my second book that generated a lot of hit was this very provocative thesis that the internet does not exist, right? And what I meant by that is that there is no coherence, right? You have to be able to disentangle physical networks from services that run on them. All of them run in different logics. All of them are subject to different economic regimes. All of them are subject to different political regimes. I think we have to be very careful in not lumping all of them together, because it then ties our hands when it comes to policy. So I actually see no problem in trying to figure out how you can lay cables differently, right? How you can do that part of infrastructure differently, because I don't think that will actually harm the cause of freedom or freedom of expression, right? I don't like the term internet freedom, so I try to get away from it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about the state of freedom of expression, right? Or the ability of the government to abuse its power, right? And I think there are certain decisions, like trying to maximize the government's information sovereignty, for example, right, which is a popular term these days, that need to be understood and need to be translated into policy terms, right? And so that's why I think all this rhetoric about the fear of the balkanization of the internet, it's pure propaganda from Silicon Valley. I mean, they do think that if you go and tinker with one single service online, it will automatically destroy the internet. The internet will just break. And I think that this is the kind of rhetoric that actually ties our hands, in that we are not engaging in any kind of institutional imagination that we need to be engaged in, right? So the key challenge is to figure out how we can continue experimenting with infrastructure, with services, with software, with hardware, without being told that if only we go and tinker with something, then this entire empire will just fall apart. I mean, if it's so powerful, how come it is so fragile?
In your article about this NSA affair, you developed the idea that we are but we are headed towards what you call an information disaster or an information apocalypse, like we were heading to an energy disaster with global warming, because we use energy without caring how much it costs. So tell us about that idea.
Sure. Well, part of my analysis, part of my take on the entire Snowden affair is that we are conducting the debate on very limited terms so far. We're only talking about the legal side of things and about the technological side of things. So the geeks tell us that they can build wonderful tools that will protect us. And then the politicians tell us that, well, there are some loopholes in laws that they need to close. And both of those groups, the geeks and the politicians, pretend that it's just a problem of abuse, right? Or it's a problem that can be fixed technologically. And I think that we need to have a much broader intellectual framework for analyzing what's happening, because here you need to engage with questions of capitalism, questions of consumption, questions of how in the future we will be paying for everyday life, right? And we will be paying for it with our data. And my expectation is that in 5 or 10 years, most of the household objects you have in your house will actually be free, but they will have sensors in them, and those sensors will be collecting data about how you use them, and it's that data that will pay for those objects. All of that data becomes an asset, it becomes a commodity. So to be able to understand what the political implications of this would be for democracy, and I think they will be huge, because my decision to record something about myself and to share this data to get an extra benefit will directly or indirectly have an impact on you, because institutions will also change how they work. So if you are refusing to monitor yourself, they will think that you do it because you have something to hide, right? And it's the kind of indirect consequence that is appropriately handled through ethics and morality and also through markets, right? So essentially I need to be able to decide whether I want to share my data, even if I can get paid for it, if it has this moral and political consequences. And that's the moral and ethical layer that we currently don't have. We can't even articulate it. And this is why I made the comparison to the Green Movement, because that was how we used to think about energy. We thought that energy was abundant. We thought that you don't have to worry about leaving the lights on as long as you could pay for them. Right? But the only reason why we didn't worry is because our economic models could never factor in the potential disaster that's coming. And now we have developed, partly thanks to the Green Movement, we have developed this extra layer of thought So we actually confront the moral and ethical consequences of our decision to keep the lights on.
Yeah.
And we need to figure out how we can develop a similar ethical framework for how we engage with information. And particularly with information as an asset. Because we don't know how to price it correctly, because we don't even know the role that information and data plays in democracy. That's the problem. With energy, it's actually simpler.
But would that be an individual decision, or how society can address that?
Well, I mean, I don't think that as an individual, I don't think you would be able to resolve all these questions on an individual level. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be having a conversation about the politics and the ethics of data use. Data is essential for public policy purposes, but it's also essential for these new startups that are building services on top of it. And we have to be able to, on the one hand, do something about that, right? Do something about our policymakers who now prefer to tinker with the symptoms of a problem because they have enough data. I mean, think about how we are solving the problem of terrorism in America. Right now, the way to solve the problem of terrorism in America is to study everything that we can about kids somewhere in Yemen to make sure that the most troublesome kids in Yemen cannot board the plane. This is how we're fighting terrorism right now. We're not even asking questions about why those kids in Yemen become radicalized. And if we did, we might discover that their radicalization might have something to do with our use of drones in Yemen to go after, their fathers, right? But that's the kind of big structural issue that becomes very hard to tackle once you can focus on low-hanging fruit. And you can focus on the low-hanging fruit because you have enough data. So you can be going and identifying all these symptoms without doing anything about the structural causes of the problem itself. Right? And this is what bothers me so much, that for bureaucracies, for example, the current environment we're in is perfect. Right? Because it allows them to perpetuate what they do without changing anything.
And behind that is the attitude that you point out, that innovation is accepted as something necessarily good and inevitable, right? This idea that innovation is always good.
Yeah, I think innovation is the new politics. We cannot talk politics anymore. We cannot actually come together as a society, as a polity, and figure out how we ought to live together and what we ought to change, and when we have to stop, and who has to suffer. So we instead hide in this apolitical language of innovation, where we think that, well, we'll just build more stuff, and that stuff will just be available to everybody. You don't even have to figure out how to distribute it anymore, right? So the main preoccupation of politics that has always been with politics ever since ancient philosophy has all been about distribution. And now you have all these Silicon Valley thinkers and gurus publishing books with titles like Abundance. Right? They do think that they might be able to transcend the old school politics altogether and just build enough apps, build enough cars, build enough smart glasses, build enough tools that will make questions of distribution completely irrelevant. I just think that this is a fairy tale, but it's a fairy tale that does appeal to a lot of people because it gives them this very nice, encouraging message that somehow the history is over, right, as we figured out, and now technology will do what politics has failed to do for decades.
In the economy, that idea led to the crash of 2008. What is this information disaster that you talk about? What is it?
Well, I mean, but the information disaster I'm talking about is precisely the collapse of democratic politics as we move into an era where essentially the technocrats can optimize and solve every single problem armed with the data on the one hand, but also with technological interactive infrastructure for getting citizens to do what citizens ought to do. So just to give you an example, here in America, there is a lot of fascination with behavioral economics and nudging. A lot of policymakers in Washington want to nudge citizens to do things that citizens would not do otherwise. So we tend to think that the reason why people in America are obese is not because there are some structural problems that have to do with the food industry or its power, or because we are under-regulating them, or because there is lack of infrastructure where people can exercise or walk. I think that happens because people are just stupid, and they make stupid decisions. So how do we solve that problem? We try to make it so that they make fewer stupid decisions, right? And now think about the role that our technological infrastructure plays in all of this. Your smartphone basically monitors everything that you do, but it also has a screen and it has internet connectivity, so it can actually influence your behavior by telling you, well, you should exercise more at the end of the day. You should eat less. You should go to this place and not to that place. And this new privately provided infrastructure for problem solving is being actively tapped by policymakers, not just in the US, but also in the UK, who are fascinated with how they can actually make nudging a little bit more technological. And to me, this just means the death of politics altogether, because again, we are basically offloading all problem solving on the shoulders of the citizen. Instead of figuring out how we can actually do something about lack of infrastructure, the power of companies, or the power of corporations, or the power of Wall Street, we're just saying that essentially everything that's wrong with your life is your own fault. But now there are enough apps to help you get out. So learn the right apps, install them, embrace this logic, and get out. And for me, that is already an information disaster, because it means that all we can do is just to basically tell people, you're on your own, get on with it. And I'm just not sure that that's the kind of future where I want to live. And the role that Silicon Valley and its technological infrastructure plays in it, to me, is very disturbing, because it's all served to us as an effort to improve how we live, to improve how we make decisions. It's all being served to us in this rhetoric of empowerment. We need to have access to our genomic data. We need to have access to our other types of data, because it's all about freedom. It's all about empowerment. But of course, once you have access to your genomic data, then you're being told, well, you should have done something about that potential risk for cancer. Why didn't you do something about that risk for cancer? And once that's the conversation, then it all becomes individual responsibility, right? It's no longer a question of public health. It's no longer a question about public reform. And that disappearance of the public as a way of tackling problems scares me a lot. Because it is all shrouded in this language that is all about empowerment via tools, access to tools. That's the
What is the way politically to address that? Parties like the Pirates in Germany, would there be a way?
Yeah, no, I don't think that the Pirates actually doing things right. I think that they fell for the same trap.
Maybe our viewers don't know what the Pirates are.
The problem with the Pirates in Europe is that they, again, are also going after, to me, phantom gods like internet freedom. I don't
explain what the Pirates are.
Oh, so the Pirates. So the Pirate Party are a new political movement that first appeared in Sweden, but then since then has spread through Europe, and there are even smaller offshoots outside of Europe. They won some seats in the European Parliament. They won some seats in the regional parliaments in Germany, some in Sweden, and there was a lot of expectation that they'll actually make it into the German parliament, but they didn't in the last elections, because people are losing interest in them, even though the Snowden case was supposed to actually bring attention to them. That didn't help.
But they're trying to address the same issues you're talking about.
No. I mean, they can't think politically. That's their problem. All they think about is the digital, the future of the internet, the future of internet freedom, right? And it's a very apolitical vision for what such a movement can do. I think essentially a movement like this, that I'm pointing to as potential savior from information apocalypse, if you will, that movement ought to be able to talk politics. It has to start with the basic question of how do we preserve freedom, how do we preserve democracy, and only then go down to the technological level and figure out how the question of freedom and democracy translates into objects, networks, protocols, applications, and so forth. The Pirate Party starts from a completely different end. They say, well, we want to preserve the freedom of technology. Let's do it, right? So we want to protect internet freedom. And I have no idea, first of all, what internet freedom means. Very often it's just a label that Silicon Valley uses to make sure that no one regulates its activity, because why would you want to constrain internet freedom? But it's also, its connection to actual freedom is not obvious. And that was part of my initial argument in my first book, that you can have plenty of internet freedom in a country like Belarus or Russia, which do not engage in internet censorship to the same extent as China does, and still have no real freedom. I mean, that's the paradox, that internet freedom doesn't translate into freedom. So part of my critique of some of these new emergent social movements has been that they need to learn how to talk politics. They need to learn how to identify how matters come to matter, so to say, right? They need to understand the difference between tackling problems individually and tackling them publicly. They have to understand that there are structural constraints and structural powers out there that need to be tackled, and it's not just about providing more information. and they need to be able to talk about money. They need to be able to relate all of these questions to finance, to capital. Unless they have that broader background, this effort will be doomed.
Yeah, as you say in your book, the internet is just a consequence, right? It's not a cause of anything, right?
Exactly, and I think that's the danger that a lot of people have in conceptualizing these terms. They think that the internet is just this new thing that just dropped from the sky. It was just invented, it was discovered, and it had nothing to do with previous efforts. And I think that this is a very misleading logic, because even a search engine like Google might seem very revolutionary, but the basic conceptual ideas that Google draws on, they have to do with information science and library science on the one hand, but then also with something called scientometrics. It's the ability to track who quotes whom in academic papers, which has been with us for quite some time, right? And we tend to forget all of that, and we think that it was the internet that gave us Google, and not the other way around, right?
Finally, behind all this, there's the idea that you point out in your book that we think that technology can make us perfect, right? But making us perfect is not really something that is even desirable, right? Because we are imperfect, right? So develop that idea.
Part of my critique was that we need to go and make a case for imperfection. We need to understand how much imperfection we want to have in our institutions, how much imperfection we want to have in our own lives, and only then figure out how technology can help us deal with reforming those institutions or reforming our lives. We cannot assume that just by recording everything, making everything more transparent, eliminating hypocrisy, eliminating ambiguity, eliminating lying from politics or our own lives, we would necessarily be in a better world. And that, I think, is the conceit of many people in Silicon Valley. They think that if they can build an app that will tell you when your friend is lying, you'll end up with many more friends, or friends that will treat you better. And I just think that this is the most ridiculous idea ever. I mean, you do need some kind of prevarication and some kind of ability to hide things if you want to cultivate rich and meaningful relationships. Otherwise, you just end up in this very tyrannical sort of village-like place from which modernity was supposed to help us escape.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you so
Very
much.
good. Thank you.